Something moved across the deep ice on 4 low limbs. Its body pale and built for a cold that should have stopped a heart in minutes. The tracks it left pressed into the snow, measured warmer than the air above them. That warmth is where I want to begin. Warm tracks in a place where warmth is the rarest thing that exists. The interior of that continent runs colder than almost anywhere a body can stand, and the ice there is old, pressed down over ages until it holds no life a person is supposed to find. The descriptions, when they surface, are unnervingly consistent, low to the ground, pale, almost translucent at the edges, as though the skin were thin enough to let the light through, eyes that reflected nothing back, and a stillness, always the stillness, before it turned and moved away without hurry. Nothing complex is meant to live out there, not on the deep plateau, not through the long dark of the polar winter, not in air that freezes exposed skin faster than you can react. Whatever left those prints was not passing through. It belonged there. That is the problem. Let me be fair to the people who have an answer for this, because their answer is a good one. The mind, they say, does strange things in that kind of place. Sensory deprivation, endless white, weeks of darkness, isolation heavy enough to bend what a person is certain they saw. The condition even has a name among people who overwinter in the polar dark, a fog of the mind that settles in during the long night, blurring attention, stretching time, conjuring movement at the edge of vision. Under those conditions, a pale shape on the ice is not a mystery. It is expected, and there are the hoaxes, which are real, and which I will not pretend away. Expeditions were expensive, and the men on them were bored, competitive, and prone to embroidering a hard season into a good story. A false track is easy to press into snow. A tall tale travels faster than a correction, so the official picture is not stupid. It is careful, and it is mostly right. Most sightings in cold and dark and solitude are the mind filling silence with shape. Most strange tracks are wind, pressure, or a joke that got away from its author. I accept all of that. I do, but here is the detail. The careful picture keeps stepping around, and it is a small one. The tracks that measured warm were not measured by a frightened man in the dark. They were measured by instruments, in daylight, by people whose entire job was to distrust their own eyes and record only numbers. A hallucination does not warm the ground. A hoax does not sink a thermal signature into the snow along a line of prints, warmer at the center of each depression, cooling outward, exactly as a living body pressed into cold would cool. That reading is not a feeling, it is physics, and the reading appears more than once, not in one journal, not in one season, not from one nation's team. That is the thing that moved this from a curiosity I could set down to a question I could not. One warm anomaly is an error, a repeated one, across decades is a pattern. Let me lay the pattern out slowly, because its power is in the accumulation, not in any single piece. Take the early expeditions first, the heroic years, when men crossed that ice on foot and by sledge and wrote down everything, because writing was all they had against the enormity of the place. In those journals, buried among weather notes and ration counts, you find brief lines that do not belong, a shape seen against a ridge that no one approached, prints crossing a route hours after the party had passed, where no party had been. Nothing dramatic, just an observation, recorded, then dropped. Move forward a few decades to the great scientific year, when the nations of the world put their rivalries aside long enough to blanket that continent with stations and instruments and careful men. More people were on the ice than ever before. More eyes, more recording devices, and the brief lines multiply. A seismic team logs a low signal moving through the ice that does not match any known source, too slow for a quake, too rhythmic for settling, tracking a path across the survey grid over several nights and then gone. In the report, it is listed as an instrument fault. The instruments checked out fine. A meteorology crew photographs a break in the ice near their station and, in the developed frames, finds a pale form at the edge of the opening that no one remembers standing there. The photographs are catalogued, then reclassified, then absent from the archive entirely. The catalogue number remains, the image behind it does not. Now, stop with me here, because this is where an honest person has to slow down. Missing photographs are not proof of anything. Archives lose things constantly. Films degrade, boxes are mislabeled, careless hands discard what they do not understand. A gap in a record is usually just a gap. I know this, but a gap has a shape. When a record is lost by accident, the loss is random, a little of everything, scattered without meaning. When a record is lost on purpose, the loss has edges, it clusters, it removes one kind of thing and leaves the rest untouched. And these gaps have edges. The weather data from that meteorology station survives in full. The ration logs survive, the equipment inventories, the radio schedules, the dull machinery of a season on the ice, all of it intact. Only the frames showing the opening in the ice are gone. The mundane was kept. The anomalous was removed. And it is not one station. Follow the same shape of absence across the continent and you find it repeating. Different nations, different languages, different filing systems, different decades. Wherever a record of the pale form on the ice should exist, there is a clean and specific hole where it used to be. This is where I have to stop and admit that the pattern creates a problem worse than the anomaly itself. Because if these records were removed, someone removed them, and the someone would have had to reach across the deepest rivalries of the last century to do it. Consider what that means. The nations that ran those stations were not friends. For much of that century, they were rivals of the sharpest kind, watching each other, spying on each other, spending vast sums to stay one step ahead. They agreed on almost nothing. They trusted each other with less. Coordination between them was nearly unthinkable. And yet, on this one continent, they agreed. They signed a treaty setting the whole of it aside. No weapons, no claims pressed, no secrets of the ordinary military kind. They opened their stations to each other's inspectors. On the coldest ground on Earth, the coldest enemies became strangely, suddenly cooperative. Ask yourself why. The honest answer is that the treaty has a perfectly ordinary explanation, and I will give it its due. Nobody wanted a war over ice. Preserving the continent for science was cheaper and safer than fighting over it. Cooperation there cost the rival powers nothing they valued. That is a complete and reasonable account. I believe most of that. What I cannot make fit is the uniformity of the silence underneath it. A treaty explains why nations would share the ice. It does not explain why the same kind of record would vanish from every one of their archives in the same way, without anyone comparing notes. So I stopped looking for the architect. There is no memo, no order, no signature, at the bottom of a directive to erase these things. I do not think one exists. What I think is stranger and harder to hold. The silence did not need to be organized. It organized itself. Think about how it would work without a plan. A surveyor files a strange reading. His supervisor, career-minded and sane, does not want his station known for ghost stories, so the reading is quietly filed away. The next man up wants no controversy attached to his program, so it stays filed. No conspiracy, just incentives. Multiply that choice by every station, every nation, every year. Each institution, acting only in its own interest, buries the same inconvenient thing. No one coordinates, no one has to. The uniformity comes not from a shared plan, but from a shared pressure, felt by people who never met. That is worse, because a plan can be exposed. A plan has a center, a paper trail, a person who breaks and talks, but a silence that grows from 10,000 quiet cowardices has no center and no confession to extract. There is no one to catch. There is only the shape of what is missing. Now let me return to the creature itself, because a pattern of missing paper is not a living thing, and I do not want to lose what all this silence is shaped around. The surviving reports, in fragments, in the margins, agree on details no group of separate liars would invent the same way. They agree that it did not flee. Nearly every account describes the same wrongness in its movement, not fear, not aggression, but a slow, deliberate withdrawal, as though the thing had decided the encounter was over and simply ended it. Animals born to a place do not fear the strangers passing through it. They agree that it left no remains. In all these decades, across all this ice, not one body, not one bone, nothing a hand could carry back and set on a table and demand an answer for, which the skeptics rightly seize on. No specimen, no science. On that point, they are completely correct. I have sat with the no specimen problem longer than anything else, because it is the strongest thing anyone can say against all of this. Extraordinary claims demand physical proof, and here there is none. If a real population lived out there, something should have died where we could find it and been left behind. And then I learnt where they might not have to leave anything behind, and the ground shifted under me. Because beneath that ice, sealed off from the surface for longer than our species has existed, there are lakes, liquid water, vast, dark and warm relative to everything above, hidden water under miles of ice. This is not fringe speculation. The existence of those subglacial lakes is settled, accepted, mapped. There are hundreds of them, some enormous, connected in places by rivers that move beneath the ice unseen. An entire dark hydrology exists down there, cut off from our world, running on its own terms. That much is simply true. So consider the possibility, because I am not asking you to believe it, only to hold it. If something lived in that sealed water and surfaced only rarely, briefly, at the openings where the ice cracks through, then the surface is not its home. The surface is the shore it visits, and a creature that only visits the shore does not die on the shore. It dies below, in the dark water, where nothing we have ever sent could reach it, and nothing could ever be recovered. The absence of a specimen stops being a hole in the theory. It becomes exactly what the theory predicts. I want to be honest about how dangerous this is. A theory that explains away its own lack of evidence is one you should distrust. The moment a claim says the absence of proof is itself proof, It has made itself impossible to disprove, and what cannot be disproved is worthless. I know that trap, but there is a difference between a claim that hides from evidence and one that finally makes sense of it. The warm tracks, the creature always near the cracks and openings, the way it withdrew downward, toward the ice, when it left. Every strange detail points the same direction, down, not away, down. There is one more thread I have to pull, and it is the one I like least, because it stopped being about paper and became about people, the witnesses, not the anonymous logs, the men and women who saw the thing and lived to describe it. What happened to them afterward follows a pattern too. They did not vanish. No one silenced them in any dramatic way. What happened was quieter. They came home and found that no one would let them finish the sentence. A raised eyebrow, a change of subject, a gentle suggestion that the ice does things to a person, and they learnt to stop. That is not suppression, and I want to say so plainly because it matters. It is only how people treat a story that sounds impossible. The witnesses were not threatened. They were gently, socially corrected until silence felt easier than speech. It happens to true stories and false ones alike, but run it forward across a century and watch what it does. A social pressure that quietly teaches every witness to stop talking produces the same result as an organized campaign to silence them, without anyone choosing it. The innocent explanation and the sinister one leave identical marks. That is where I get lost, because if the innocent process and the guilty one leave the same fingerprints, then I cannot tell them apart from the marks alone. I cannot prove a cover-up, but I also cannot rule one out. The evidence is silent in a way that is perfectly consistent with nothing to hide, and perfectly consistent with everything. Come closer to the present, to the era of deep drilling, when teams bored down through miles of ice to reach that hidden water at last. If anything would break the silence, it would be here, a direct line into the world where the creature is supposed to live. And something did happen here. The drilling projects that reached that water are real and documented, and their public results were duly modest. Traces of life in the samples, microscopic, unremarkable, the kind of finding forgotten within a week. Nothing to alarm anyone, nothing to hide. On the record, at least, nothing unusual at all. But look at what surrounds the modest result, and the old shape returns. Instruments lowered into the lake that stopped transmitting and were never recovered, written off as failure. Sample sets on the manifest that appear in no published analysis. A borehole sealed early, for reasons called only operational. Small, familiar things. Every single one of those has an ordinary cause. Instruments fail in conditions that brutal. Samples get contaminated and quietly dropped. Boreholes are sealed early when budgets run out or ice shifts. Taken one at a time, not one of these needs anything stranger than bad luck and tight funding to explain it away. Taken one at a time. That phrase saves the ordinary explanation every time, and it does enormous work. Yes, any single anomaly dissolves under scrutiny, but the pattern was never in any single anomaly. It is in how many there are, and how they all lean the same way. Here is the test I keep applying to myself, and I offer it to you. Flip a coin 100 times, and a few runs of heads mean nothing. That is chance. But if every run falls to heads, and all the runs of tails have vanished, you are no longer looking at chance. You are looking at someone quietly picking up the tails. And what unsettles me is not that I can name that someone, I cannot, but that no one needs to be named. The coin was tossed by 10,000 hands, and every hand on its own, for its own reasons, kept only the heads. I have gone as far as the evidence lets me, and I want to be clear where that leaves me. I do not know that the creature is real. I cannot show you a body, a photograph, a signal I can defend. I have no proof. I have only the shape of an absence. But an absence with edges is still a thing. I can trace it, I can measure it, and when I lay the whole of it out, the warm tracks, the vanished frames, the treaty of enemies, the failed instruments, the witnesses who fell quiet, the absence has a consistent, deliberate outline, and here is the part one cannot walk back from. We have already reached the water. The drills went down. The lakes are no longer sealed. We opened the door ourselves, and we have no idea what we opened it into. For the first time in the history of that ice, the seal is broken. If the silence I traced was real, then somewhere in the records of that first contact with the water is a page that has already been removed, or is being removed now, or will be removed by a hand not yet decided. The pattern, if it exists, is not finished. It is ongoing. I keep thinking about what it means that we went looking, not the creature, us. For 100 years, if the pattern is right, our institutions worked, without ever agreeing to keep that thing beneath the ice and out of the record. And then, quietly, methodically, we drilled straight down to where it lives. I do not know which is the more frightening thought, that we spent a century keeping something hidden, or that having hidden it so carefully, we then went down to knock on its door. Both cannot be prudence. One of them is something else, and I have no name for it. So I will leave you where the ice left me, standing over a hole bored miles down into black water that was sealed since before there were people to seal it, listening for whatever might be listening back. The door is no longer shut, and nobody will tell me what is on the other side.